Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind, episode 110.
If there's something I want to know about my students, I ask questions. If there's something I want to know about my children, I ask questions. And when I ask good questions, I get good answers. When I ask bad questions, I get no answers.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Brian Ricks. Brian was born and raised in Southeast Idaho. Together with his wife, they have 6 children. They've tried several different approaches to education and changed their approach about every year. He has a bachelor's in finance and a master's in religious education and a PhD in educational leadership. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you.
Great. I'm really excited to have you on our podcast. It's going to be a fun episode about what services you offer with your website and also your podcasting and books and stuff. So we're excited to talk about that. Do you want to briefly tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah. So like you mentioned, I was born and raised in southeastern Idaho, and I've been about as far as public education can take you, I guess you would say, getting a PhD. Some of the things, I started out just a really typical public school product in the sense that I thought schooling had to take place in rows and desks, and the best learning happened from 8:10 to 3:35 or whatever time your bus picks you up. And that the very best way to do it was, you study 1 hour at a time, and no matter how well you were doing or poor you were doing in a subject, you always changed on the hour to a new subject. Those were things that were just kind of ingrained in me from the time I was a little kid. Having gone through some of the higher levels of education, I think one of the things that struck me the most was that in the graduate level of learning, what we would say, the public school would say, is the upper echelons of learning, they don't do it at all like that. My graduate education was totally different than what people did with me when I was in elementary school. I just started kind of considering where that was at, and I started looking back on my own experience. I have one little sister. She and I went through school, and we took very, very different paths. We had very different opinions about school. For me, it was a very social experience. I did as little as possible when I was in high school. When I got to college and realized how easy it would have been to get the scholarships, I just wasn't motivated. There wasn't much in high school that grabbed me and propelled me to try and excel. Everybody was pretty happy to just let me go by being mediocre. And so that's kind of what I did. And I talked to my wife. I got an undergrad. I got my bachelor's degree because back then a bachelor's degree was for me what a high school diploma was for my dad, and so that's what you did. But the only reason I finished my bachelor's degree, I was working as an electrician with my dad at the time, and I went to him and said, I'm done with school. I'm tired of taking generals that don't mean anything. And my dad, who is one of my greatest mentors, and I'm extremely close to my father and very grateful for a lot of things, but this being one of them, he sat me down and said, if you quit college, I'll fire you. And I said, what? And he just said, I don't want a quitter working for me. He said, so part of your staying on and working here and continuing your electrical apprenticeship is getting your bachelor's degree. He said, I don't care if you ever do anything with it. And he said, there's nothing to be embarrassed about if you're an electrician, but you're not going to do an electrician because something else you're doing is too hard. He kind of put my feet to the fire, and so I stayed in, and I got my bachelor's degree, and that led to teaching professionally, which I've been doing for 13 years. Not public school, but adjacent to public schools, and that's been an incredible experience. And then through that, my master's and my PhD. But that experience with my dad was really critical for me because I was ready to give up. I was done with public education. And then how shocked I was when I got to my graduate level studies and found that the learning was totally different. The expectations were different, and I started to see how much fun learning can really be.
That's pretty sad that you have to get to the PhD to see that. So.
Yeah, it really was.
So I understand that as a family, you guys homeschool, and I'd love to discuss the whys behind that decision and how your personal perspective of education changed. You talked about how you felt like all that came, the learning comes from the classroom and set times and all of that stuff. How has that changed in your mind?
So I was very against homeschool when my wife first brought it to me. Our oldest son was 4 or 5 years old. Maybe she may have mentioned it to me earlier, and I've just blocked those conversations out of my mind.
Or thought, she'll change her mind, right?
Yeah, I just kind of thought, she can't be serious. Nobody in their right mind homeschools was kind of my take. And I thought, man, homeschools, those are all those kids who can't get along with other kids or who don't know how to interact. I just had that really negative stereotype of homeschooling in my mind. But education is really important to me. And by this point, I was into my master's degree. I had just started my master's degree, and I had just learned how to learn. And so I was really excited now to have a child that was in school, and we got him involved with a charter school. I was familiar with some of what I would call some of the problems with public education, especially the overcrowding of typical elementary schools. So we got our son into a charter school down here that I was really excited about. I sat on the board, helped them create go through and select the curriculum and write the bylaws, and was really excited about that. And he did that for his kindergarten year, and we had a really great experience. The teacher was wonderful. When he got into first grade, the teacher put him with about 6 other kids in the class in an advanced math program. And in a parent-teacher conference, she said when he's going to be done with first grade math probably about the end of March, beginning of April, and we're going to move him into second grade math. And I said, excellent, that's exactly what we want. And I went home and told my wife, see, that a public school can work, and you just got to find the right situation, because one of our concerns was if our kids are excelling, at the time it was the No Child Left Behind era of public education, and we had learned, at least around here, that what that really meant was no child left behind, but no child gets ahead either.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I was telling my wife, see, look, they're going to let him advance at his own pace, and this is going to be great. Sure enough, March comes, and we don't hear anything different, and first graders don't tell you a lot about what's going on. They just kind of are excited to go and see their friends and play at recess. All of a sudden, he started getting in trouble, and he would come home and say, I got in trouble today, and I got in trouble today. And being a teacher, I was immediately on the teacher's side. Well, what are you doing? And after about a week of this, my wife came to me and said, look, this isn't our son. We've not had a single problem all year. And so we sat down and had kind of a little powwow with him and said, what are the other kids doing when you and the other kids are getting in trouble? There was a couple of them that were getting in trouble with him. And he said, well, they're all doing math. Or they're all doing their math work. I said, well, why aren't you doing your math, Peyton? You've got to pay attention to your teacher. And he said, she hasn't given us any.
Oh, wow.
So we contacted the teacher, and she said, yep, he has finished first grade math, but the second grade teachers and the administration refused to let me do second grade math with him because they don't know what they would teach him next year.
Oh, wow. So it still was that same
and
situation.
So all of a sudden, my wife kind of looked at me, and bless her heart, she didn't have to go through all of the I told you so's and see, and I was like, okay, we're going to change something here. We've got to do something. And so we pulled him out of school. Even at that late in the year, we pulled him out of school and started homeschooling right away. And she started having a great experience with him. She homeschooled for a couple of years. She was really nervous about teaching our kids to read. So as his younger brothers and sisters came in, we kind of adopted a thing where we would send our kids to school for kindergarten and first grade and let them get some of those early lessons. I'm not the homeschool parent who's I actually have a lot of really good things to say about public school, even though it doesn't sound like it so far. The one thing I've learned is that so many of the challenges in public school come from the administrative limitations that are placed on teachers. I love public school teachers. I think that they are incredible individuals who have made major sacrifices to try and make a difference. And it's a shame that the administration in so many situations have handcuffed them with federal rules and regulations that are all made in Washington, D.C., that have no idea of what's going on in some small farm town where a teacher can't do what's best for her students because of something that some attorney wrote up in Washington, D.C. And that'll give you kind of an idea of where I stand on public education. I love the teachers and the people that make the sacrifices to be there for our kids. And I recognize that there are some kids that homeschool is not an option for, and the public school system does a lot of good for a lot of people. But there are ways that we could make it better, and that was what we found out in our situation.
That's great.
So that's kind of the why, and that was what took me initially from, okay, absolutely not, to let's try this. And then my wife has just done an incredible job of being creative every year. Each summer, she and I sit down and we have a discussion at the end of the school year, early in the summer, to say what worked well, what didn't. And then as the dad, I try and look for ways. I'm gone all day long, so I'm not here during the actual, when they're typically doing the schooling and the teaching and the learning. And so I try and find fun ways to get involved. And one of those is a little interview with the kids to see how they would like to change their homeschooling experience the next year.
When you talked about in your bio that you change things up every year, it's more of like, go through that of what you do and how that works and how you think that's effective for your children's education, and maybe how that's also helped with your paradigm change.
So one of the things that we do, I always start with the same question: how do you like school? And that question elicits just a huge spectrum of feelings from any child. It's no different from homeschool kids. And my kids are they're very open with me, and I hate this and I love this, and I love field trips. They always love field trips. And so I just kind of start asking some follow-up questions. Tell me a little bit more about why you were frustrated with history, or why didn't you like the worksheets that we did last year, or what didn't you like about this math program or whatever. And so as I ask those questions, those follow-up questions, those digging questions, I start to get an idea of their expectation. In any kind of a relationship, if somebody's not happy, it's because an expectation is not being met. And that's true about education. If a child's not happy with what's happening at school, it's because there's an expectation. Now, whether their expectation is realistic or not, my youngest son thinks that school should happen for 10 to 15 minutes and then he can go to basketball. And so what we work on is I try and identify what their expectation is. And if the expectation is realistic, then how can we adjust what we're doing to meet that expectation? If it's not realistic, then how can I teach them to adjust their expectations so it's more realistic? And as those expectations line up, then we see them getting more excited about learning. For example, this year, my oldest son is getting to the point to where he's feeling left out of certain things. He was going into the 9th grade and he saw some of his buddies from the neighborhood and from our local church who are getting to do things that he's not getting to do. And so he was a little frustrated with that. He had an expectation for school to offer some of these other social experiences. And so he and I sat down in middle of July and just had a conversation. And I started with that same question, tell me about school. What did you like about it? How do you feel about it? And so forth. And he expressed a couple things that became very, very obvious. Number one, he wasn't getting an experience in science that challenged him. My wife is not good with science. It's not her thing. She doesn't get excited about it. And he wasn't feeling challenged in that anymore. The other thing, we had done a program called Harmony where we really have enjoyed it. In exchange for, they give reimbursements for school materials, but it's all federal money. So like the federal government, they've got to have their fingers in everything. You had to submit a worksheet every 2 weeks to show that you were learning the things that the federal government wanted you to learn. He hated the worksheets. He felt like it was nothing but busy work and it was tedious, and we shifted with him. And what we did is we did what I'm calling a hybrid. He goes to public school for an advanced math class. He does a foods class because I told him he could have one fun class, and then he does a language class. And so he goes there for 3 classes. And then we did, instead of doing what we had done with him last year, we've shifted over to independent study through one of the universities here locally. And so that's what he's doing this year. Now all of a sudden, his experience is totally different. He's loving the time that he gets to go and spend at school. He's getting some of those social benefits that he was hoping for. And today was his off day. He didn't go to school today. He didn't go to class today. So he came with me to work, sat in my office, and my 9th grade boy literally worked on homework straight in his independent study classes for 6.5 hours.
Wow.
Without complaining, I got in, I said, hey, how'd you do? And I got 2 units done in English, and I got a unit done in my photography class. The thing I've learned in doing this with my kids is that, number one, when you make them a part of the program, when you let them have some say in it, you get buy-in. When it's partly their idea, it's the motivation is not 100% on me anymore as the parent. There's just some self-motivation that's there because this is their baby. The other thing that I found is their attention span. It doubles when they feel like they have some control, when they feel like they have some autonomy and their opinion matters now.
Yeah. Well, and I would imagine, it sounds like you're really good at following through on, you're not just asking the questions, you're actually helping to make that happen for your children. Is that
Yeah, that's critical. If you don't, I mean, it takes one conversation. I mean, we've all had that conversation with our children where in our cars home we said, hey, well, maybe when we get home we'll do. Our kids don't ever hear maybe. They hear will do. And so when we get home and things get busy and we don't do, if that happens too often, our kids start to chalk that up. And then when we say, hey, we will do, instantly the kids doubt us. And so in those conversations, because we've followed through and we've changed things up, my other son came to me, said kind of the same thing about one particular group of worksheets. There were 4 different subjects that we did worksheets with last year that kind of went along with the curriculum. And he came and just said, I didn't like, it was a history. He said, I'd rather do a different kind of history. So we did that. He kind of gave a little bit of a fit when his mom asked him to do something on his own while she was working with some of the other kids. And when I got home, we had a little chat, and all I had to do was sit down and say, do you remember when we had the conversation, you said you wanted to try something different, and this is what we picked? Oh, yeah, I remember. So that's the other thing that following through does is when I follow through, I can require them to follow through.
Yeah, that's for sure. So do you kind of want to reiterate with us? I mean, you talked about how you were completely against homeschooling. How do you feel like your paradigm has changed over that time and with experience? And where would you say your educational philosophy lies now? When we talked about, you do value those public school education, but I guess we've kind of talked about, mixing it up for your kids has helped them have some buy-in, but give us your overall paradigm.
Well, change. Like I say, and I think every educational paradigm is always in flux. I think it's always developing, and as we gain more experience, things change. But I was what I would say a very typical public school product at stage 1 when my wife and I first met and got married. I think the thing that first started me to change was when I realized that the system was prohibiting a teacher who wanted to do good things with my child, and the system was holding her back, an administrator, teachers above her. And that was the first time, I think, where I really kind of stood back and said, wow, there are some major flaws here. And that was, and especially because that was in a charter school that I had helped write the bylaws for, and we had kind of geared this charter school towards letting children excel. And so I realized that, wow, there's
no matter how much involvement you have, like you said, I mean, you were writing it and stuff, you've got that government agency over top of you.
Yeah, and that, I mean, if there's always lots of things that can be tweaked and improved, but that was kind of the beginning for me where I was like, wow, there's something better out there, at least for my kids. And so then the process kind of changed, and it, for me, I kind of gave the reins to my wife, which is one of the huge benefits of having, a spouse or a companion that you really completely trust. I knew that my wife had the very best intents for my children. She didn't want to ruin them. And so I was willing to kind of step back and say, you know what, let's let her take the lead. And so a lot of my paradigm shift continued as I watched her. But it was interesting. We started pretty much like a public school. And I think it's one of the biggest mistakes homeschool parents make is we try and gear our homeschool after public school in their model. We're going to do math, and then we're going to shift to English. And where my philosophy's changed as far as education goes, I've seen the benefit in my children of giving them some autonomy and letting them pick what they learn. One of my favorite educational quotes is that the best lessons are caught, not taught. What I've seen happen with my kids is when they're excited about something, they're catching things. They're the ones that are asking questions. And in a typical, what I would consider a typical class setting, it's usually someone at the front trying to teach something. And that's usually just not the most effective way of learning. And that's come a lot through my own experience in front of classes. The very best classes I've had is when a student's raised their hand and said, I've got a question. It's not really on topic, but kind of.
But at least that's the knowledge that sticks, right? When they finally...
Yeah. And it's incredible because if that's my most difficult student, I mean, I still remember an experience from 12 years ago, my first year of teaching. One of the students that I struggled with the most raised his hand and said, I've got a question about this. It wasn't in my lesson plan. It wasn't what I, the teacher, had designed to do. But I stopped and said, okay, let's talk about it. And he asked the question. And it was kind of with a little bit of, let's see if you can, and he thought he had stumped me. And it was interesting. We went through with about a 25-minute discussion. That student was totally engaged along with the other 25 kids in the class. They were right with me. I mean, every word that anyone said in that class, everyone heard. There were no side conversations. There was no. The thing that stuck with me is, as a teacher, I wasn't the one that came up with that. It was the student.
Wow. And engaged the whole class, like you said.
It did, yeah. And so somehow, whether we're doing homeschool, whether we're standing in front of whether you're teaching Sunday school, or it doesn't matter. Even if you're in a boardroom with a bunch of professionals, what we're talking about has to be relevant to them, and it has to matter to them. And if it doesn't, then we're just kind of blowing smoke.
Yeah.
And so as parents who are trying to homeschool, as we're trying to kind of perfect is the wrong word, but as we're trying to hone our teaching skills, one of the very best things we can do and is find a way to engage the kids in the learning process. And when we do that, they'll learn on their own. You know, we had one son who, my youngest son, struggled with reading. Struggled with reading. I mentioned that we let our kids go kindergarten and first grade, and so he was in partway through first grade, and they were sending home this homework that was just ridiculous. My little 6-year-old is getting like an hour to an hour and a half of homework, and I'm thinking, you've already got him for 7 hours a day. What could you possibly need him for another hour and a half for? And it was another one of those experiences where a great teacher said to my wife, I wish I could do something different, but this is what I'm required to do. And that just kind of made my hair stand on end, and I don't have much hair left anyway. So my wife came home again. It was late in the school year, similar to our first child, and we both kind of made a decision and said, "All right, let's pull him." And all my wife did, the big challenge he was having was reading. He was way behind where all of my other kids were at this stage, and all my wife did was just read with him. And they would go out and sit on the porch, and for 20 minutes, they would just read. And she chose to read scripture with him. He would read as much as he could, and then when he would get tired and she could tell that he was interested, she would take over and finish. And slowly, he would read more, and then he would read more, until he was reading half the time and then 3/4 of the time. Now, he is still not an excellent reader, but the one thing I've learned about kids is they're super resilient. And when he wants to learn, whether it's math or reading or anything else, when he's motivated to learn, he will. For example, he's just started playing football this year, and he needs to do some studying and some memorization to memorize the plays. And guess what? All of a sudden, he can memorize. So a lot of it just comes back to my philosophy. Just as a teacher or a parent, my role is to, number one, be patient with my kids and let them learn at their pace, while finding ways to motivate them to learn. So I'm not pushing and hurrying, and I'm not really worried about reading levels or grade levels or anything like that. But I'm making sure that I'm constantly trying to motivate them to go to the next, wherever the next is for them in whatever the subject is.
Before we go on, let us take a minute and hear about our sponsors. Changing a paradigm takes some study, but like me, you are probably super busy. That's why we've teamed up with Audible. Go to our website, theluminousmind.net, get a free month of Audible with 2 audiobooks, thousands of titles in exchange for only books that you absolutely love. You too can be learning on the go to keep that fire burning. Back to the Luminous Mind with Brian Ricks of 101 Homeschool Ideas. That's wonderful. I think that's a great segue into giving us the inspiration behind the blog that you have, the podcasting, and then also you were telling me about your book. Tell the audience what your book is about. Okay,
well, so we already mentioned I did a PhD, and I realized when I finished with my PhD, it was kind of a weird, surreal feeling. I wasn't going to the university every day. I wasn't working on a dissertation every day, and I was sitting at home, and I realized that nothing had changed for me professionally. I was still going to the same job, doing the same thing, and it looked like I would keep doing that. And so we kind of started asking questions about what was the purpose of the PhD. And my wife started commenting to me about the fact that she wished there was some resource for homeschool parents to learn teaching skills. She thought, these public school teachers go to school And they learn all of these skills, all of these how-to techniques of asking questions or teaching math or, using object lessons, whatever. And so I thought that with my, then 10 or 11 years of teaching experience plus the PhD, maybe there was something we could offer to the homeschool community that would kind of fill that gap a little bit. It's not necessarily here's a lesson idea. Here's how to teach when to use periods. Instead, it was more of a let's teach some skills. Let's teach some practical skills, and we've tried to kind of salt and pepper it with a little bit of both. Here are some real specific, just some fun ideas you can use, but we've really tried to cater it to, again, that same teaching philosophy of do things that are fun, that engage the kids, that get them excited about learning, because once they're excited about learning, the rest is really quite easy. We started that podcast and a website, 101 Homeschool Ideas, in January of 2014. We try and get about one episode a week, so 4 a month. That's been a lot of fun. I've got to meet a lot of really great people. I've done some interviews with other homeschool parents, which has been a huge help for us, and that's helped kind of assist me in my paradigm shift or evolution. And then about 8 months ago, we kind of started looking again at, is there anything else that we can do? And one of the things that my wife and I attended some seminar on parenting together, or listened to a talk or something, and we were talking about the conference was on how parents communicate with their kids. And I realized that how I communicate with my kids is a lot similar to how I communicate with my students in a classroom. If there's something I want to know about my students, I ask questions. If there's something I want to know about my children, I ask questions. And when I ask good questions, I get good answers. When I ask bad questions, I get no answers. Usually they just kind of stare at me. And I've just heard a lot of stories about parents who are frustrated when their kids come in from playing with their friends, or they come home from an activity and they say, "How was your day?" And they don't get much response, and especially in the teenage years. And so I kind of bounced this idea off my wife about what if we wrote a homeschool book, or what if we wrote a book for homeschool parents all about how to ask better questions so that you get better conversations with your kids.
Well, and do you feel like when you ask better questions, kind of like that example that you gave of the student who asked the question, it engaged the whole class? I mean, do you feel like when we ask those really great questions, we help inspire better learning?
There's no question. Questions are the key to learning. It doesn't matter what major scientific breakthrough, cultural breakthrough, it doesn't matter what advance you're talking about. It always comes because someone asked the right question in the right way at the right time.
Yeah. Well, and the scientific method, basically. I mean,
it's all questions. It's what do I see? What do I infer from what I see? Now can I do some tests to see if what I'm inferring is actually what's happening? But it comes down to those initial questions. And as long as we ask poor questions, we'll get poor results. As parents and teachers, it's exactly the same. And so the other thing I've learned over 13 years of teaching is that you're never going to get the answer you want on the first question. It's usually question 6, 7, 8. The best idea, a teenage girl who's upset because some friend did something. Typically, my experience has been teenage girls are not going to tell me what's wrong with the first question. It's going to be, I think that there's some strategy on the part of a teenager that way, because by holding things that are important to them back a little bit, especially things that make them vulnerable, they protect themselves. And so they can throw up that kind of stagnant, plain Jane answer. And if you accept that as a parent or as a teacher, that sends a signal that you didn't really want to know the answer.
Wow.
And so as I continue to ask follow-up questions and then listen, the most important skill in asking questions is when you're not saying anything at all. And those cues that you send that tell them, for example, waiting long enough, giving them an opportunity to kind of digest your question and formulate an answer and then say it in a way that they think makes sense. What you do is you send a message to your children or to your students that I really do want to know what you think, and so let's talk about this. And when they give you a plain Jane answer, with sensitivity, you can say, well, that's really interesting. Something as simple as, tell me a little bit more about that. How did that make you feel when you felt like that? And those are just some off-the-cuff things, but those kinds of follow-up questions encourage a teenager or a young child to kind of drop that protective wall, because they're starting to see that what matters to them really matters to you, and they can trust you with this issue. So we decided to write a book, and we just about how to have good conversations through effective questions. In fact, the title of the book is Leading Discussions Through Effective Questioning. I really think it's beneficial for parents in their child relationship. It's beneficial for teachers, homeschool teachers even though it's typically the same person, there's a different relationship when you're teaching. It's a teacher-student relationship a little bit. And I also think it's effective if you're a boss, you're an employer, and now all of a sudden you've got an employee that some things changed. The skills that I talk about are not necessarily specific to education, but just to life in general. And these are questions that we can ask that demonstrate we really want to know the answer, and they help us get to a level of conversation where problems can be solved.
That's great. Well, and one of the other problems that I have is that sometimes we'll be, and this isn't specific, like questions that like your teenager may ask that are like, what do you think about this? It's more like we'll be out. This was our whole trip that we just came back from, that we're out and about and they'll ask, well, how was this made or whatever. And I just have a hard time, like, I don't know the answer right then. I mean, how do you respond to your children that helps that you can kind of bring those questions back into the learning? And most of the time I totally forget like the question that they ask. What would your advice be on that of, when you're kind of out and about and you don't necessarily have the answer right then and there in front of you?
The first thing I want to know is how serious are they about knowing the answer? And so I'll just kind of turn it back to them and say, well, I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head. Jet engine. Let's say we're at an airport and my son says, how does a plane fly?
Yeah.
Sometimes that question is just kind of and they're not really interested. And one of the things that I've learned is that if they're not really interested, then they're not going to really learn even if you give them the right answer, because it's not a question they're passionate about. And so I'll usually say, well, I don't know, take a look. What do you notice about the plane? And I'll just kind of give them cues. The same thing that I would go through. I would ask them the same questions I would ask myself if I was trying to figure it out. Well, what do you notice about the plane? You mentioned it before, that scientific method. Well, it's got a couple wings. The jet's underneath the wings. And I would just, anything from things that might be important or might not be important, what do you notice about the shape of the wing? Oh, wow. Okay, so the top of the wing is beveled, but the bottom of the wing is flat. Keep that in mind, write that down, and let's talk about it when we get home.
Yeah.
If I'm out and about and then what I do is I put it on them to bring it back to me. That kind of tells me if they're really interested or not. Sometimes they'll forget because, wow, life happens and they're moving on. And the next time I see a plane, I'm going to say, oh, I love my electronic device because I can quickly step to the side and say, hey, remind me to have a conversation with Payden about how airplanes fly.
Yeah. And I love the fact that you turn it back to them, because if they go research it out and just basically report back to you, they're going to learn. And then, like you said, if that's really something that they're interested in learning about, they'll learn it and then come back and report it back to you. It makes a big difference in what
I think the great part about that is one of the things that you're teaching your children is when you take their questions seriously, that you're emphasizing to them how important it is to ask questions. And when kids ask questions, their rate of learning increases.
That's wonderful. Yeah, that is true. So how do you think families can benefit the most from adopting your philosophy? Because it is a different philosophy than I've heard before. Basically some things that you feel like
some benefits
that they can get.
Well, I think the first thing is, whenever we have quite a few first-time homeschool parents reach out to us through email or through the website or the podcast and say, okay, I want to homeschool, what next? And the first thing I always say is, okay, forget about school for a month. I'm a big believer in the fact that relationships are critical, and so often when we pull kids out of a public school system, if that's the situation, you've got a child who has been in public school and is not, there's going to be some repercussions, and there are friendships, there are relationships that are at school that are now going to be cut off, and one of the very most important things you can do is establish a relationship connection between you and your children. That will build the trust. Your children they'll have that trust, and then as you get into teaching situations, because you've built that trust, they're going to be willing to be vulnerable with you. Now, sometimes as parents, we think of vulnerability as being in physical harm, and we think, well, of course our children are never vulnerable in front of us, because they should never feel vulnerable because I'm always going to protect them and I've never done anything to physically harm them. But looking stupid in front of your parents, that's major vulnerability for a kid who wants nothing more than to make their parents happy. And so when we start homeschooling, if we jump right in to teaching and we haven't really established a stronger relationship, then our kids are not going to, they're going to hesitate. They're going to put up that wall and they're going to hesitate to look vulnerable in front of us. And it's interesting, as a teacher, I've seen that kids have a lot of ways to get out of situations where their vulnerabilities could be exposed. I ask my students to do a lot of stuff together, and I ask my kids to do a lot of stuff together. I have my older son work with his younger brothers and sisters to help them learn concepts that he should already know. I've watched both my children and my students at work. As soon as I say, okay, I want you to get together and do this, hey, can I go to the bathroom? It's an escape strategy, and I watch my children do it. I'm not feeling well. That's another one that my kids do. I don't feel good. But you were just 5 minutes ago, you were outside playing, and you were fine. Sometimes as parents who are also homeschooling, we have to pay attention to these cues where our kids may be trying to avoid a situation where they're not comfortable being vulnerable. And if that's the case, then the key is not to revisit the lesson. The key may be going out to get an ice cream cone and just talking to your kids and building that trust so that they're more comfortable being vulnerable. Another key is going to be, I think, an important part of education is for your children to see that education doesn't stop at high school or even college. Education continues, and the very best thing we can do as parents is to be an example of that. Continuing to learn. I constantly have a book out that I'm trying to get through. My wife and I are constantly having conversations about what we're learning, and it sends a subliminal message to my kids that's often explicit as well, where I'm saying, look, do you see how I'm still studying? You're not going to ever finish studying. When they see that, and then they build that core confidence with you as a parent, they're a little bit more comfortable sharing that vulnerability, and especially if they've seen you vulnerable as well. For example, I'm not super great at English, but my kids still see me, even though I've graduated, I still write papers. I just finished writing this book. If there's a subject that I'm studying that I want to understand better, I write a paper on it. Most of those papers will never be published anywhere, but I write the paper because it makes me wrestle with the weakness, and when I wrestle through it with that weakness, I understand it better. My kids have seen me do that, and so because they've seen me be vulnerable, they're willing to be vulnerable as well and ask for help. And so I would say as a parent, if you're just starting, one of the benefits for what we talk about and how we help parents who are just starting is take off all the pressure of doing it just right and go have fun. Go to the movies and go sit down and at the end of the movie, sit down and talk with your child about what they learned from the movie. That'll be a new concept for most kids, that they're supposed to learn something from the movie. I took one of my sons to Inside Out, the new animated film about the emotions, and we had this great conversation afterwards about what was the message of the movie? What do you think, from an 11-year-old perspective, what did you see the lesson being? And it starts with, I don't know. Well, okay, let's go back to some key points. And then I ask, what happened at this point? What happened at this point? And give him some of the key information from the video so that he remembers them. He remembers movies very, very well. And so he could say, and we just keyed in on those at the last minute or the last part of the show when she was remembering all of the happy things. What immediately preceded those? Well, they were sad experiences. Okay, well, what do you think Joy learned when she made that connection that happy experiences are sometimes connected to really sad experiences? You start having those kinds of conversations with your kids, and all of a sudden it's not, they don't even think they're learning anything, but you're teaching them the very most important lessons in life.
And revisiting it like that helps that stick. I mean, and then it has meaning to it, correct? Is that?
Yeah. Well, and then all of a sudden, now the next time my 11-year-old, the next time he suffers some sad experience, I can now sit down with him, and instead of me constantly helping him through this, I can walk him through the process of him getting himself through a sad experience by helping him see that, hey, do you remember what that movie taught us about sad experiences? What do you think you can expect in the next couple of days? However that conversation will go. And what I'm hoping to do is, and we do this, I do it with my older child, my oldest son. He wanted to go to the play Les Mis, and so we said, okay, he was in 6th grade. We said, okay, you can go to the play in Les Mis, but you've got to read the book first. So we gave him an abridged copy of the book Les Mis, and it was still an 800-page book.
Yeah, I would imagine.
And I said, here, you read this, and let's have a conversation. you can do the same thing. We want our kids to learn about forgiveness. Well, you have it's about 2 pages, 3 pages in there where Jean Valjean steals the silver from the bishop, and then the bishop forgives him and gives him the candlesticks. You can do the same thing with an older child in Les Mis that I did with my son in Inside Out. And what you're doing is you're laying the foundation so that when somebody really burns them, when somebody really betrays them, they have a foundation where you can then go and take that and help them walk through the process of forgiveness. If we're careful in picking our curriculum, there is so much good in classic literature. If we're careful in picking our curriculum and as parents we're involved in the reading of them and we're reading a little bit ahead, that's one of the things that I talk about in my book is we're missing out on some really great opportunities to teach life lessons, not just school lessons, but life lessons, so that our kids become very well-balanced, self-adjusting adults.
Yeah. Well, and I love how you talk about the vulnerability and then also how you express that. I've heard people, their vulnerability is like, well, I'm not very good at math either, so I'm the always make an excuse for their children, so you won't be as well. But you're showing, how do you think that's the difference between vulnerability where, you were talking about how you're not very good at English, but you continue to write versus just saying, well, I'm not very good at English.
Yeah. I've got my oldest son, I'm trying to remember what sport it was, tried something for one season and was like, well, I'm not good at that. So I guess I'm not going to do it. And I was like, it doesn't work. We had this whole conversation. It doesn't work that way. And it's going to be that way for the rest of their lives. Every time you show up on a new job, every time you take a new class, every time you do something new, you're going to be at the bottom of a learning curve. So if our children learn now that it's okay to work through vulnerabilities, it's going to help them along that learning curve because they won't stop every time they come into they bump into an obstacle. So lifelong, I think that difference is critical.
Yeah. Well, and I love how you're mentoring that too. That you're not giving up.
Yeah.
Makes a big difference.
It does. I think so often, maybe the very best example is as parents, we've all found ourselves saying something that we promised ourselves we would never say. As parents, we heard our mom or our dad say something or react in a certain way, and all of a sudden we find ourselves in a similar situation, and those words are coming right out of our mouths. I think that same thing is going to be true with our kids and their educational stick-to-itiveness, or their vulnerable stick-to-itiveness, whatever you want to call it. Their reaction to resistance is going to be, I think, very similar to what they witnessed their moms and dads do when they came into contact with resistance. It's just natural. We just pick things up like that.
Yeah, like you said, the best lessons are caught and not taught.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is scary for us on the other side of things.
Yeah, sometimes my kids are fishing when I don't expect them to be.
Exactly. So do you want to tell us what maybe some of your long-term goals are for your website and your podcast, and then also with your book?
Well, our mission stays the same as through the homeschool, or through the 101 Homeschool podcast and website. And now the book, our plan for the book is to do a series, and we've kind of him-hawed around with some different names for the series, but basically just a homeschool teaching skills series, one on questioning. We've talked about doing one with object lessons, how to incorporate things that your kids are familiar with into lessons that will help them accelerate their learning. Doing a series of that, and then just coming out, having a goal of doing a book a year and having those just roll out. A lot of the decision to do object lessons has come from a response that we got from a podcast. And so there's a lot of give and take between the website and the podcast and now these books that we're writing. Our mission is just to help homeschool parents be as successful as they would like to be. Whatever that success is measured for them, we'd like to help provide some of the skills that they need that they didn't get because they're an accountant or because they, instead of doing education in school, they did chemical engineering or whatever. We just want to offer a place where parents can go without being inundated with a whole bunch of other things. Here's a place where they can come to get some practical ideas, but more importantly, some skills that will help them build relationships in that teaching setting.
Yeah. Well, and kind of like what we discussed at the beginning of our conversation, that there's a big difference between a homeschooling, like learning how to do homeschooling skills with your children versus a teaching, a teacher doing, and I think that's essential, that those are practical ideas that you can use in a homeschool realm versus a, larger classroom format type of thing. Those are great. Well, as you go through those, definitely let me know. I'd love to have you on and talk about each one of those. But
for sure.
Great. So if you could leave a legacy, what do you hope it's going to be?
You know what? As I've gotten a little bit older, and that my idea of a legacy has definitely changed. I remember as an undergraduate in the business, I wanted to be a CEO, and I wanted to make a lot of money, and I wanted to leave this legacy of wealth. I wanted to be powerful and make decisions that would influence other people. And what I'm learning when it comes to education is that when we teach with power, and when we effectively teach with power, that's what I'm trying to say. We can change a child's life. And when you change one child's life, you change the lives of anyone that child comes into contact with. And I know that seems so pithy, and we say things like that all the time, but the older I get, the more I really, really, truly believe that. And we're all familiar with the saying, give a man a fish, feed him for a day, teach him how to fish, feed him for a lifetime. But one of my associates added to that, or heard from someone else that added to it, teach a man to teach others how to fish, and you've fed a generation. I guess if I could pick my legacy at this point, I want to be known as a great teacher who helped other people become better teachers.
That is great. Kind of the difference between those two, you're talking about building that wealth. Yeah, it passes on to that next generation, but I think what you're talking about will pass on several generations, that continues way beyond whatever, like you said, that idea of like giving that fish makes a big difference. And we all see like the Paris Hilton, she's got the money, but what goes on past that may not be a ripple effect type of thing. So great.
Yeah, it kind of stops.
Yeah, exactly. So do you have any final parting words of advice for our listeners? And then please just give us your contact information of how we can get in touch with you.
Okay. My parting advice is recognize your fears, but don't ever be paralyzed by them. I know that there are people that reach out to us all the time, to me and my wife, either that we know here in our community or that have reached out to us through the internet, and they want so badly to do something more for their children, but they're afraid to homeschool because of one concern or another, and it's usually some false stereotype that they assume is true about, they know one family in the backwoods of somewhere that homeschooled and their kids turned out, or it's just, and they find out that really the fears, the things they were afraid of weren't reality. And so I think it's important to address your fears and be honest with yourself about what you're afraid of.
Well, and if you recognize that it's a fear, you can move past that, because sometimes when at least with myself, when I've had those fears, I accept that as fact, where if I don't ever recognize it.
It is that I'm afraid of something. And so that's how it is exactly, no matter what. If we realize it as just a fear and then kind of start to be honest with ourselves about, okay, what am I, sometimes we're afraid of what other people are going to think. Yeah. And sometimes we're hesitating to do something that we want to do because we're afraid of what our friends will think or our family will think. And as a parent, it's been helpful to me to say, okay, well, what would I teach? What would I tell my child who was not doing something that he thought was good because he was afraid of what his friends are going to think?
Yeah, when you turn it around like that.
What would my counsel be? How would I counsel my child in that situation? And all of a sudden, then it becomes such a no-brainer. But the other thing, as far as advice, is that you're not ever going to ruin your child. Children are super resilient, and as a parent, you're already the best teacher they ever had. You've taught them how to walk. You've taught them how to talk. You've taught them how to behave in certain circumstances and how to behave in other, how to behave differently in other circumstances. That's exactly what you as a parent have. That's what parenting is teaching. And so don't let fears, which are sometimes not even real, don't let those fears paralyze you into not doing something that you feel like would be beneficial to your child. That's my advice. I think I wish more parents who had the desire would be willing to just jump in with both feet. You can always put them back in school next year. You really can, and you'd be surprised how quickly they'll catch up.
Yeah.
If you did nothing with your kids, you can always put them back in school next year, and they'll catch up pretty quick.
Yeah, exactly. So go ahead and give us your contact information.
So you can get a hold of me in a couple of different places. Probably the easiest, you can go to the website at 101homeschoolideas.com. If you leave a comment on any one of those pages, I'm the one that gets all of those and responds to all of those. You can get me through email at brian@101homeschoolideas.com. Those are probably the two easiest ways to find us. You can always find us on iTunes if you just go into iTunes and type in 101 Homeschool Ideas, our website or our podcast will pop up and you can listen. We've missed about the last month as I've been putting this book together, but we're getting ready to launch a whole bunch of episodes here in October, so we're excited to get those going and rolling back out again.
So is it you and your wife, or are you the main?
The podcast is mostly me, just because my wife hates talking. You'll catch her. I think I've gotten her onto 2 episodes. I got her on the very first one, and then somewhere around episode 55, I got her to come in and share some insights. But yeah, it's usually just me, and we talk about anything from different curriculums you can use, how to build relationships of trust, some specific teaching. My all-time favorite episode we did, and by far our most popular episode, I've done a couple episodes on just silly games you can play with your kids, and those it's so funny that is what has really taken off, and parents have absolutely loved this idea, and part of our philosophy, this idea that you'll get more accomplished tomorrow if you put school aside and play a game with your kid today.
Yeah. Like you said, there's some buy-in after that, right?
Yeah, for sure. And the kids know you love them, and it's just and there's just a comfort level that comes, especially if you're new to homeschooling. There's a comfort level that comes after games and time. It's just with time spent together doing things that the kids love to do. There's a comfort that comes that they're not used to having with you, because educationally they've been with somebody else. If they've been in public school for 5-6 years, there's going to be some relationships that need to be built there, because they're not used to having that teacher relationship with you.
Yeah. Well, and that's a whole nother conversation that we could go into, is how to, kind of de-school your children.
Yeah, for sure. Unschool them, get them, deprogram them. That's another reason why we say, man, if you're just starting, no matter where you're at, take a month off.
Yeah.
Just to kind of, my wife laughs and says that it's a detox.
But it is true. Different philosophy, different way of doing stuff.
It is, for sure.
Great. All right. Well, it's been fun having you. Thanks so much, Brian, for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much. I really appreciate the time to come on and share some ideas.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. To learn more about Brian Ricks and the 101 Homeschooling Ideas, go to our show notes at theluminousmind.net. Be sure to become a subscriber to our free email list and consider joining our program by going to the scheduling tab to become a fire starter today. Help support the podcast by making all your Amazon purchases through the free Amazon widget on our website. Also, sign up to receive 2 free audiobooks from Audible at theluminousmind.net. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, Google+, and now Pinterest. Get our audio content by subscribing on YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher. To help us grow, consider telling your friends about us. Leave us a review. Tell us how we can help you, so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education